Chairman, we are now live.
Thank you, Nikki. Welcome everybody to this virtual meeting of the External Services Select Committee at the London Borough of Hillingdon. This virtual meeting is also being broadcast simultaneously on the Council's YouTube channel, Hillingdon London, so welcome to anybody who's watching. The purpose of this committee is to hold to account those bodies outside the Council who provide public services in our area. We do this by reviewing the performance of external bodies and undertaking in-depth reviews and witness sessions on topics, submitting any findings we have to the decision-making cabinet. My name is Councillor Nick Denys and I am chairman of this committee. Before we start, I'm going to just do a bit of online housekeeping. Please can all participants ensure that any mobile phones around you are on silent and any home listening devices such as Alexa are turned off. Please can you keep your microphone muted when you're not speaking and then unmute to speak. As chairman, I will call on those to speak during the meeting. And if you want to raise the hand, that's at the sort of top of the screen, then I can note down you want to speak. So that's probably the best way. In terms of technical meeting control, if any councillor leaves the virtual meeting partway through for a period of time, for example, lost connection, I will continue the meeting unless we are not quorate, which is 5 councillors. Before we start the meeting proper, I'm going to do a roll call. So this involves me introducing each person who's here in the meeting, and if you could indicate that you're present, that would be great. First of all, my Vice Chair, Councillor Devi Reddy.
Thank you, Chairman. I'm present.
Fantastic. Councillor Simon Arnold.
Good evening, Chairman. I too am present.
Good evening, Simon. Councillor Ray Graham.
Yes, I'm present, would you believe?
Excellent,
yes.
Thank you, Ray. Councillor Stuart Mathers.
Good evening, Chair. Good evening, everybody. I'm present.
Good evening, Stuart. Councillor Ali Milani.
Good evening, Chair. I'm present.
Good evening, Ali. Councillor June Nelson. Sorry, June, I didn't hear you then. Ooh, I still can't hear. I can see your lips moving. I can't hear you. No, you have turned your mic on apparently, but no, not happening at the moment. I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll move on to other people, June, and if you can sort the problem, just say hello and interrupt me. That's absolutely fine. I'm going to move on to Superintendent Jill Horsfall.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you.
Good evening, Jill. Thank you for joining us. Jackie Robertson, the Service Manager for Community Safety at London Borough of Hillingdon.
Good evening, everybody. Yes, I'm present.
Fantastic. And Nikki O'Halloran, our Democratic Services Manager, who helps support us. Hello, Nikki.
I'm present. Thank you, Chairman.
Fantastic. Is there anybody else who I've missed? Not at this moment in time, and June is still having mic issues. Okay. If these mic issues continue, Nikki, do you think June should dial in or?
Well, I wonder if Councillor Nelson would like to leave the meeting and then rejoin to see if that fixes the problem.
Okay, yeah, that's probably a good idea. Yeah. Excellent. Okay, so, right. While that is happening, I will move forward with the agenda, and if anything is discussed which Councillor Nelson wants to come in on, then very welcome to accept it after we move the agenda item. So, first of all, Nikki, do we have any apologies for absence?
Chairman, we've had apologies from Councillor Harangi.
Okay, thank you. Any declarations of interest? If there's silence, I will assume that to be no. Yep, there's silence. All items are considered in part 1. I'm right in thinking that, aren't I, Nikki, that every item is in part 1?
That's correct, Chairman.
Correct. Yeah, so basically it's on the YouTube channel, so the public and the press can watch if they wish to. And item 4, I'd like to receive and agree the minutes of the meeting of the 9th of February 2021, which is our last meeting. If anybody has any comments on those minutes, please let me know. I'm assuming silence is that we agree the minutes, so the minutes are agreed. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Excellent. And that means we can move on to our first main agenda item, which is the Safer Hillingdon Partnership Programme report. Essentially, this is to do with our duty to talk about the sort of the crime aspect and how that's being managed within our area. So if it's possible, could Jill, would you be happy to sort of first start talking, just give us your impression about what's been happening over the last few months and any issues you think that we should be aware of?
Yes, certainly. I've looked primarily at the last year rather than the last quarter per se, but I think we're still in quite an unusual time actually in terms of crime and antisocial behaviour. We are still seeing a good impact on crime levels as a result of COVID and as a result of most people obeying with restrictions and local lockdowns. So on the whole, broadly speaking, most categories of crime are down across the board for Hillingdon, and the total notifiable offences for the year are down 11% on the previous year. There are some really good reductions within that, particularly in areas like robbery and burglary, which have come down considerably. And we're obviously hopeful that we'll keep that momentum going and not see an increase again as people start to become out and about more. Violence offences overall are down. There are some areas where we are seeing an increase, but those are areas I think perhaps that would be expected. Drugs offences, for example, antisocial behaviour, which is very difficult to split out in terms of categories because a lot of those are COVID-related calls that come in and are categorised as ASB. And DA violence offences are up slightly on the previous year. Again, unfortunately, as we expected, and we think largely as a result of COVID and people having more time inside when perhaps they might previously have had more reasons to leave the house. If anybody would like figures on particular crime categories, I have those, but I don't want to bore you with stats unless you particularly want them. So I'm willing to take questions on any of those, obviously.
Thanks, Jill. Yes, no, we'll try and we'll cover obviously as much as we find interesting in the questions. But before we move on to the questions, I'd like Jackie Robertson to basically briefly explain from her point of view the current state of play.
Thank you, Councillor. I think I can only echo what Jill has said in that the figures that we are seeing, whilst favourable towards some crimes, we're also seeing are having an impact on others. And I think I could echo what Jill is saying, and I will bring up a couple. I think also the figures are quite reflective of how restrictions are tightened and then relaxed. So we're seeing a difference between the quarters. So, for example, reducing violence without injury, which one of our targets was to reduce by 5%. So the target for quarter one, so that's looking April to June, was 1,100 and the outturn was 1,279. Target 2, again 1,100 and the outturn was 1,470. So the full year target was 4,401 and our actual projection is 5,498. But when I looked back over the figures for quarter two for the year 2019-2020, the outturn was 1,219 and quarter two 2020-21, as I've already said, was 1,470. But whilst quarter three figures are just being prepared at the moment, the outturn for quarter three of this year was 1,280, which shows a decrease in violence without injury by 12.9%. And that is something that is mirrored across some of the areas that we're currently showing, which are showing red at the moment. We are showing quite big reductions. So another one, to give you an example, is reducing community and neighbourhood reports by 5%. Last year, the outturn was 352 for Q2. This year, the outturn for Q2 was 429, but for Q3 of this year, it's 222. So there was actually a decrease in 48.3% between those two quarters. Jill's already mentioned domestic abuse, and we have seen a small increase in recorded incidents of domestic abuse in Hillingdon, but that's reflective of what's going on in the rest of London and indeed throughout the UK. When the restrictions are relaxed further, we expect to see another small increase, because obviously victims are able then to access support more readily and use mediums that they would prefer to report, i.e. the telephone or face-to-face services, as they become up and running again. And obviously at the moment during lockdown, some of these services have been carried out remotely. I don't know whether you want me to go on to say what we've been doing during the pandemic to try and combat that.
Yes, please. That would be good. Thank you.
Okay, so if we just look at domestic abuse then, as more people have been working from home, we realise that working from home isn't necessarily the safe space that we all initially thought. So for the London Borough of Hillingdon, we put together an employers initiative. So that's for our council staff. And that was launched. And then following on from that, we've worked with the Hillingdon Women's Centre and GROW, which is an organisation which supports women to get back into employment, and the Sharon Project. That initiative is called Workplace Safe Space, and it's, as I said, it's an extension of our own employers initiative. But what the initiative has done so far to date has trained 48 organisations, different businesses across the borough, and nearly 200 employers and employees on how to acknowledge, respond to and refer incidents of domestic abuse in the workplace. So that's quite a positive. Moving forward then, we've also in the process at the moment, and this is quite timely following the tragic death of Sarah Everard, where we've seen a marked sea change in preventing and tackling domestic abuse, particularly in open spaces. So at the moment, we're currently developing the nighttime economy strategy. So I think all in all, what we've done throughout this pandemic, and as I said, some of the figures are quite skewed for obvious reasons, but what it's allowed us to do is to look at what we're currently doing, how we're currently working, and how we can work better in collaboration with the partners, particularly the police, and how we can obviously better our services. Now, something else that we're doing at the moment, which you may be interested in, is to talk more with our communities to find out what is really troubling those communities. And one of the initiatives that we've put together at the moment, and we're working closely with Hillingdon Neighbourhood Watch and the police, is to strengthen if you like, the arm that goes from the Hillingdon Neighbourhood Watch to the ward panels to then the Safer Neighbourhood boards. So we've already had one meeting down in the south of the borough with Neighbourhood Watch coordinators to try and increase the number of watches we've got, to look at what's working well and what we could do to improve if you like, that community tie. And we had a meeting with the police, with the Hillingdon Neighbourhood Watch and different representatives from the council. and we're hoping that those meetings can move forward on a bi-monthly basis.
Brilliant. Thank you, Jacqueline. Right. OK, I'm going to take Chair's prerogatives and ask 2 questions first. But if others wish to ask questions, please raise your hand, and I'll after I've asked my questions, I'll list who wants to ask questions and invite people in. The first question actually is based around actually what Jacqueline finished talking about, which is certainly an issue that I have a great interest in. It's sort of triangulating the police, local communities and the council, and making sure that these 3 different groups work together in order to essentially use their resources to solve crime. Now, you have obviously different levels of active neighbourhood good groups in different areas, but now with like on home CCTV, all those sort of things, you know, in some ways some neighbourhood groups anyway feel like they can offer a lot more. But I have heard the criticism that which might be just anecdotal, that actually sometimes they feel like that when they're reporting crimes, they're not necessarily being given the support to utilise the skills that they have. The neighbourhood watch stuff seems to be good and then sort of drop away, and I'm interested to hear that it's sort of coming back in terms of a focus, which is really interesting. So I'd like to get both your views really on how we can get those 3 parts working together in order to essentially solve crime and move issues on. So Jill, I'll ask you to come in first, as Jacqueline was talking last. Any sort of overall views on that, how we can do that?
So I guess following on from Jackie's input, something that I could add to that is that one of the things that we're doing internally is looking at all our ward panels and reviewing how well they're working and trying to ensure consistency. It may be that some of the councillors in this meeting are members of ward panels, because I know Hillingdon's ward panels do have good councillor attendance, but that isn't the case across the board for the whole borough. And some ward panels, I think it's fair to say, are probably more effective than others. So we're reviewing the ward panels, how we set priorities, and sort of terms of references for those, to try and make sure that we are properly targeting our neighbourhood resources where the ward panels want them to be as much as we can. So that should feed into the, you know, listening to the local communities and making sure that we are responding to their concerns. And then I think the other thing that we're very lucky with for Hillingdon is that there's a good take up of resources like OWL, and there is really good CCTV coverage, exceptionally so compared to some boroughs actually. And I think that we could probably get smarter at using that and sharing information in relation to that. I do sometimes get some comments about frustrations in terms of who to channel inquiries to, and you know how that information should be shared. But I'd thought we'd smoothed that out a bit more recently. It's something Jackie and I have spoken about quite a bit in the past. So if you have any ideas as to how we could improve that, I'd be very open to hearing them.
Interesting that you say that, because later on we're discussing our future work programme for next year, and actually this is one of our potential sort of more in-depth topics that we might be taking on, but because it's definitely something that you know, we know that the potential's there, and I mean I attend my ward panel and I find it really useful and really good actually, and I'm glad to hear that across Hillingdon councillors are getting involved with that. But Jacqueline, what's your sort of view on this sort of triangulation that we're talking about, the community, the council and the police, and how really to get the best out of the 3 bits working together in order to deal with crime and antisocial behaviour? I think
for me, communication is key, and that is that holds the key to everything. It's about listening to residents and joining together. So to give you an example, when I started to speak to neighbourhood watch coordinators, a couple of them were bringing up topics, for example, or their concerns, which really weren't a police matter. It's to do with residents parking and things like that. And that's why I think it's really important that we get these neighbourhood watch meetings up, where we have got the neighbourhood watch, the police, the council, our CCTV manager all present, and the safer neighbourhood team. So if residents are raising concerns that are quite clearly something that the council can resolve, we are then there that we can deal with it straight away, or we can take it away and then come back to, to the resident, and they're not left in limbo. But I think it's really important. I'm really keen for us. I think we have a really good working relationship with the police, and that spans across several different departments. I think we're working well together at the moment, but I am quite keen that wherever we can, we listen to the community and we use that victim's voice in our decision making.
Yes, okay. Well, I'm happy to leave that there for now, and I'll bring in a couple of other committee members who want to ask questions. We might come back to this later. June, you have your hand up. Sorry, June, it's not. Mic's not working. Can I suggest that maybe you dial in on the phone, and so we can hear your voice, because I think the mic isn't working again. If that's okay. Okay. Well, as June still has some technical difficulties with her mic, Stuart, your hand is also up.
Thank you, Chair. I just to mention that the ward panels aren't consistent across the borough. I know that we have a couple in the south, colleagues constantly talking to me about ones that have struggled to get residents to lead them, or ones where there's just been inconsistency with meetings. So I'm really pleased you're looking into that area to get some consistency. If I may, I wanted to look at hate crime, and I know that here you report on 4 different types of hate crime, particularly increasing awareness. I still would like to see racial hate crime mentioned, and others around sexual orientation, but I can quite happy to hear the explanation of why you particularly focus on these 4 different hate crimes. I suppose I'm interested in kind of what the multi-agency approach is around kind of raising awareness of and increasing the reporting of hate crimes, because I'm sure lockdown has had an interesting impact on some of these, and whether there is any work being also done, or kind of how work's done differently in the sort of cyber sphere. That's the terrible, untechnical way of explaining things. But yes, online hate crime as opposed to hate crime that may be experienced in person.
Chair, shall I? So I have the figures, the hate crime figures for the last year, and you're right. COVID has done some quite interesting things to those, and perhaps not in ways that you'd expect. So, for example, Islamic-related hate crime incidents in Hillingdon are down. The only reason that we can think of for that is perhaps because Eid and Ramadan were celebrated in isolation, if you like, this year, rather than being more visible, and rather than being at local venues. Likewise, there are some areas of hate crime that are up, and we saw a rise of reports from people from certain sectors of the Asian community as a result of COVID. Transgender and LGBTQ plus hate crime is down. And again, the only reason we can think of for that is because possibly because the Pride events that would usually happen in the summer didn't happen. So again, that community may have been less visible in general. Hate crime is a challenging area for us in terms of building confidence and getting communities and members of the public to report. I think we are doing better, and we have got some multi-agency approaches which are definitely helping us. So I know, for example, we are getting reports via Upstanders, which I think is a third-party organisation that you work with as a local authority. And those are the sorts of links that we'd really like to encourage, because the key thing for us is that people report. We don't mind how they report, but the key thing is that they report, because unless we get those reports, we can't look at patterns, and we can't investigate, and we can't, build the confidence that we'd so dearly love to build. So I'm very interested in any other ideas that you may have to help us increase that community confidence. But we're really keen to improve how we deal with hate crime.
Thank you, Jill. So, Jackie, I mean, what's your perspective on hate crime? Because obviously there is the crime, which is obviously a terrible thing, but also it strikes me that this is one of those crimes where there is the wider social community aspect around it, which the police can only do so much. I mean, is this an area where the council sort of monitor what's going on and consider community relations and atmospheres in order to see, if any sort of softer stuff can do to help the environment?
Community tensions, yes, they are monitored, and that's carried out by Fiona Gibbs at the council. I would say in relation to some of the more marginalised groups, so we are continually looking at how we can improve our services and how we can reach, I wouldn't say the failed, the hard to reach groups, because we tend to say the failed to reach groups. So we do have bi-monthly training sessions, which have been a bit restricted since we've been in the pandemic, but we used to hold them, as I say, on a bi-monthly basis, and they were multi-agency, and we've covered topics, LGBT, we've looked at those marginalised groups, and looked at the barriers to reporting, why they're not reporting. So we've had talks and training sessions by Deaf Hope for people who have got hearing difficulties and they can't report. We've had Gallup come in and do presentations about people who are suffering from homophobic abuse and things like that. So we try and push the boundaries, and we try and introduce not only listening to the community, trying to reach out to those members of the community where it's been historically difficult, but we try and bring it into a training session in a multi-agency way.
Okay, I'll ask another question, and if afterwards, if June, you still want to ask your question, do put your hand up. I'd like to actually ask a question mainly towards Jill, I think, in terms of COVID, because obviously COVID has been this massive thing over the last year. I think today is the year anniversary, isn't it, of the lockdown. So any sort of stats you have about how COVID's affected policing in terms of ability to police in general, but also what's it been like in Hillingdon in terms of people breaching the COVID restrictions, and how has the policing of that worked?
It's quite a big question.
I know.
So
it's a good question. So go for it. And if there are any other bits, we'll ask further questions.
In terms of how it's been policing it, I think we were lucky in as much as when crime first started to drop significantly as a result of lockdown was when we had our highest absences for COVID-related sickness. So one of our real concerns was the fact that we were going to have a lot of officers off sick and not be able to deal with demand. And I think we were thankful that that didn't happen, because when we had our highest absences, crime was at its lowest. So we managed to hold our own with that. And then what I guess filled the void of crime happening was us trying to enforce the lockdown restrictions. Which we did in partnership with yourselves in terms of us taking the priority, if you like, for public spaces, and the local authority taking the priority for businesses and those sorts of areas. It has been a challenge for us. It's been a particular challenge because of the repeated change of legislation and the announcement of changes prior to the legislation being written. So we've always had to play a bit of catch up, and that's been very difficult. I think what I would say is, on the whole, the vast majority of people have been very compliant. It will be no surprise to know that there's always a small section of the community anywhere that is not compliant. I think for Hillingdon as a borough, I don't think that I don't see that your issues have been significantly greater than elsewhere in terms of lack of compliance, which is really interesting because I know that your COVID rates have been high. But I can't see from a policing term, I haven't seen a correlation between lack of compliance and your COVID rate as such. There have been issues. There were issues over the summer with UMEs and things like that. There were issues at the Lido, weren't there, that were a challenge to deal with. But on the whole, I think it's been, our approach has very much been engagement and explanation rather than enforcement where possible. Where necessary, we have enforced and we have issued tickets, but that has been a last resort for us because most people are compliant when you speak to them. So yeah, we're looking forward to coming out of it soon, hopefully.
Fingers crossed. Jackie, do you have any reflections on this, on sort of policing, not necessarily just policing, but dealing with issues to do with COVID and COVID regulations?
I can really only echo what Jill has said, because it has really highlighted how we've had to work smarter and how we've had to work better in partnership. Because I don't, the police, as you heard from Jill, they've had officers go sick, and likewise we have too. So I don't think any organisation can tackle a problem by itself, and that's why it's been important that we do work in partnership. I think also with COVID, what we've seen is a number of services that we deliver, particularly around domestic abuse. They've had to be delivered remotely. Our floating support service and the Richmond Fellowship, which provide therapeutic services for children who've been affected by domestic abuse. So it's just been a case of how we can still continue to provide those services and support those victims and members of the public, but in a slightly different way.
Thank you. Simon, you have your hand up.
Thank you, Chairman. One of you mentioned OWL. I think it was you, Jackie. I know when OWL launched, there was a lot of publicity around it, and I use it myself. I think it's great. It supplies lots of information, and I believe there's been quite a few successful sort of find this vehicle, or there's been some successful outcomes through OWL. Have you seen any increase in sort of subscriber base to that during COVID? And is there going to be any more publicity? Is it working from your perspective? I don't know which one of you want to answer that question.
Do you want to go ahead, Jill, or do you want me to?
So I will, and then maybe Jackie, if you chip in, because I probably won't have all the answers. So I am not familiar with what the subscriber numbers are, I'm afraid. I was worried this time last year that funding for OWL might mean that we had to stop using it. And that always makes me quite anxious in terms of trying to promote something that we then no longer can support. I gather this year MOPAC have agreed to fund it moving forwards, although I haven't seen anything formally about that. But I'm optimistic that we won't have the same last minute panic that we had last year. I'm not sure that answers all your questions, Councillor, but Jackie may have something in addition.
I think there are, and I might have this figure wrong, but I think the last figure I saw, there were about 1,800 subscribers to OWL across the borough. I personally think it's really good. And again, we're looking at different ways. We work closely with the Neighbourhood Watch, obviously, who subscribe or who run OWL with the police. But it's also about how we can get other messages out. So I know at the moment there's crime prevention advice going out, but we're also looking at perhaps getting out messages, for example, from trading standards and scams and different things that the council can contribute towards that. We do take the opportunity. We have multi-agency partnership days, which we roll out across the borough, which we, for want of a better word, we will target a particular area, and it's about how departments from the council work in partnership with the police and, for example, the fire brigade. So, and during those days, we take the opportunity to deliver and speak to residents about OWL and the benefits of OWL. We put leaflets through doors and we have them in an information hub. So that might be, for example, at the moment during COVID, it will be set up in a library. Pre the pandemic, we would set up an information table, normally in a large supermarket where there was a high footfall of residents, and there would be a number of officers from the council, the police, and we would talk to residents about different services that we can all offer.
Thank you to you both.
No, I mean, thank you both. I mean, obviously, OWL is, I agree with Simon, it is a very important tool. I suppose we'd like the numbers of people signed up to be higher, but yeah, no, definitely, if it was suddenly taken away, I think there would be a big gap in that community engagement. So I think that's something that we might want to come back to in the future, certainly, about how that's being used along with other ways in order to sort of triangulate those, the people, the council and police to be able to sort of create safer neighbourhoods. So that's very good. Thank you. June, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Yes, brilliant. Thank you.
Yeah.
Go for it.
Praise the Lord. My question, I don't know if it's for Jacqueline, it's to do with antisocial behaviour and complaints that has been lodged. And I have got a set of disgruntled residents who are very unhappy in regards to how the antisocial behaviour, when they reported it, how it's being dealt with. And I mean being dealt with in regards to you do get a response, but the response is very vague. And therefore, there is no follow through. And this is really causing a lot of disquiet and a lot of uneasiness with residents with antisocial behaviour on both spectrum. Can you tell us how is antisocial behaviour being dealt with, the time scale for it? And I know who respond to it, but it's just not coming out in the right way. And it needs to be addressed in the antisocial behaviour team. Can you update on that, please?
Councillor Nelson, antisocial behaviour isn't within my remit, but if you would like to send me the details through, I'm more than happy to follow up for you and find out where those complaints are and how we can address them. More than happy to do that for you. For myself personally, as I said right at the beginning of this, I believe communication is key to everything. And I know sometimes people feel frustrated when they call and they seem to go into a bottomless pit and don't get the answers they want. So for me, I go out and speak to residents, and I have done on a couple of occasions very recently. I go and speak to them in person and try and resolve their issues. If I can't resolve them on the spot, I come back, I speak to the people who can help, and then I send them an email afterwards telling them what action's been taken.
Okay, I will forward that through. And just one more bit in regards to the police, because I know with COVID and not being able to get out and about, but also is how they respond to us, and the response doesn't come through when complaints are made. It takes some time. And I know for my area that I covered, Heathrow Villages, I know a couple of the officers, they were off and they weren't able to respond. But it would be much more encouraging if we can get a little bit more dialogue with them. We do have a very active community group that works with the police, but it's just, I think with everything that's going on, it's not functioning as it should function.
Okay. I'm sorry to hear that. I guess I would have two pleas in relation to contacting the neighbourhood officers. The first is that I would always, and you might be doing this, but I would always ask that you use their team email box rather than individual emails, because we find all too often that people email individual officers and they can't pick up their emails, obviously, if they're not on duty or sick or on leave. So team email addresses always rather than individual ones. And then the other thing that I would say is, if it's something that needs dealing with straight away, even if it's a non-emergency, 101 or report online might get you a quicker response than waiting 3 or 4 days for your neighbourhood officers to come back from leave or from sick or whatever. So you should absolutely be getting a response though. So if you're not getting a response, feel free to escalate it either to me or through Jackie or the ASB team within the local authority.
Thank you.
Before I bring Stuart in, I just want to ask basically about policing levels in Hillingdon. Have you got an update in terms of the numbers of police that we have sort of based in Hillingdon? And also, obviously, I mean, I know it gets a bit complicated now. We're in the tri-borough arrangement where teams are sort of shifted between different boroughs. I mean, there was a bit of a worry when the tri-borough arrangement happened that, shifting teams to different areas might be difficult because certain teams were based elsewhere. I mean, do you think that actually policing numbers and policing itself has been just as effective with sort of splitting our teams all over the place in West London?
So I would say yes. You sort of answered part of your own question for me there, Chair. I think it's very difficult for me to give you figures because we are a BCU rather than a borough, as you said. So a lot of our resources are BCU resources rather than Hillingdon resources per se. But obviously our response teams are split 3 ways. So you have an emergency response team that parades out of Hillingdon as a borough. Was previously at Hayes, is now currently parading out of Uxbridge. But the response teams very much flex. So if, for example, the Hillingdon officers got hit by test and trace for COVID, and suddenly 10 of them were off and couldn't come in tomorrow, we would flex officers across from Ealing or from Hounslow, depending on what was appropriate. So you would not be left short. In relation to our specialist teams, our local investigation teams and our public protection teams cover the whole BCU. And again, they react. They're both reactive and proactive, but they will go where the demand is. So again, I can't give you set numbers for how many people you have working on Hillingdon cases, but you have the numbers to meet the demand. And the benefit of the BCU is it gives us that ability to flex. So while you may think that it looks like the resources are stretched 3 ways, actually they're flexed 3 ways, which is much more resilient.
Okay, thank you. Stuart.
Thank you, Chair. I want to talk a little bit about digital presence, and then I have a very specific issue, which I've got lots from Facebook. Which, so I know that the local police teams they use Twitter quite a lot, and that's a strategy of engagement and awareness. Obviously, different social media platforms have different audiences. Twitter's great for politicians and celebrity, well, less celebrity, let's say, just more public figures. But a lot of issues I see around crime particularly come through Facebook community groups. If there's national events, they'll be on other platforms. And I'm just wondering what the approach is in terms of engaging with people through more digital means. And specifically to that, so as councillors, we probably see a lot of issues or trends coming up in local streets through local Facebook community groups. And one that seems to have a lot of, whether it's fear or an actual threat, is catalytic converters being stolen. And sometimes you can say, actually, that's a video from miles away, but actually increasingly there are examples in, well, where I am in West Drayton, but in different parts of Hillingdon, and people are aware of the vehicle reg, they're aware of, they've got some Ring doorbell footage, no other brands are acceptable, but it's that kind of, they feel like they've got enough evidence, but there's obviously no dialogue through Facebook groups because there's no police presence, and I don't expect police staff to be constantly on Facebook. But it's that kind of, how can a digital presence be built in other platforms? And then secondly, more specifically, what are you doing to challenge the catalytic converter thefts?
So that the digital platforms thing is really interesting, and I am perhaps not the right person to talk to that, because it's not a field that so I'm not on Facebook, for example, so it's not a field that I particularly have a grasp of in that sense. But we have discussions centrally in the Met around what our digital footprint should look like and what is practical to manage on a day-to-day basis, because what we don't want to do is get involved in something that we then can't support. And Facebook is a really good example of that, because it's so popular. It would be really challenging for us to properly monitor it and respond to things on it. But we do have a central team which is called, it's got an acronym obviously, but it's basically inclusion and engagement, and they are looking constantly at how we can better engage, including on digital platforms. So I can ask that question to them specifically about Facebook and how we could utilise that better. In relation to catalytic converters, it is a real issue, and it's probably the most significant motor vehicle issue for us. Met-wide and nationwide, I would say. It's not borough specific, and it all comes down to money, doesn't it? They're valuable pieces of kit that obviously retail quite well for people who are looking for money. On a higher level, there's a lot of conversations going on nationally with motor vehicle manufacturers, because ultimately they need to be made harder to remove. Which is kind of what that comes down to. So that's the strategic piece, is the national conversations with motor vehicle manufacturers. On a local basis, there is a lot of advice around better ways perhaps to park your car. So, you know, if you're lucky enough to have a drive, whether you reverse in or drive in, all those sorts of things to make your converter less accessible to somebody. I appreciate not everybody's fortunate enough to have a drive. And then we are doing a lot of enforcement work, and we're having a lot of really good results in terms of catching people who are engaged in catalytic converter theft. The problem is because there's so much money in that market that as fast as we catch people, others will take their place. So it's a bit of a long-term issue, I'm afraid. There's no quick win on this, and it's very much about, you know, it's almost the new crime, isn't it? In that sense, it's the topical thing for people of malicious intent in terms of an easy buck, and we just need to keep plugging away at it.
Thank you. I've got two more questions, and after that, if there are no hands up, we'll end. So if you do have a question, anybody else on the committee, please stick your hand up during that time. My first question is about e-scooters. What's being done to police e-scooters? Now, of course, probably everyone's aware that there's been quite a proliferation of the use of e-scooters, and you sometimes see them whizzing very fast past you on the pavement with kids on, and on the road with people without helmets on their texting away or whatever like that. And it seems to be a bit of a wild west out there in terms of e-scooters. So I can appreciate they're probably quite difficult to police in some ways, but what is being done to police this rise in use of e-scooters?
So again, that's, I mean, and this is really topical, but it's another really challenging area for us. So if I start sort of at the top, strategically, what should be happening is anybody who sells somebody an e-scooter should be pointing out the legalities or not of where they can ride them. The bigger chains, I think, are doing that. I think that some businesses and shops are not doing that, and obviously some people are buying them online or selling them on and all those sorts of things. So it's not a perfect world in terms of getting that message out there. I think there's a potential for some confusion at the moment, which we're trying to message out, because some cities are starting a e-scooter pilot for e-scooter hire that can be used on the roads. the difficulty with that, or the difference with that, is those e-scooters that you can hire to be used on the roads have a speed limit, a speed cap that can't be exceeded. And they've been properly risk assessed and introduced in consultation with the relevant people. But at the moment, London is not part of that pilot, and they cannot be legally used on the roads unless you have insurance and a driving licence, and anything else that you'd be required in terms of using a vehicle on the roads. So in terms of what we're doing about it, there's a couple of key issues for us at the moment. One is obviously safety, because we think that people are making themselves vulnerable by using them on the road, particularly when they go inside on the inside lane of cars and things like that, because drivers are not looking out for them, which is understandable. And then we've also seen more recently, not specifically on Hillingdon, but in general terms, them being used, people either being robbed for their e-scooters, or e-scooters being used as a method to commit crime because they're a silent approach. So they have been used in some boroughs to commit robberies and things like that of pedestrians, because they're a silent approach and a relatively quick getaway. So in terms of enforcement, we are trying to stop people where possible. It isn't always easy. Obviously, officers who are on foot, so my neighbourhood officers can't stop e-scooters. It's very difficult for them to do that. And motor vehicles, response officers will stop e-scooters where possible, but there's a limit to how much they'll chase them, because then it puts the rider at risk. But if they do successfully stop an e-scooter rider, they will start with engagement around, do you realise that you can't do it, you shouldn't do it, it is illegal, you can have a fine, you can get points on your driving licence. And we are giving people fines and points, particularly if we're stopping them and we find out we've stopped them before for the same thing. You should only need one warning. And obviously there are aggravating factors which may mean that you go straight to enforcement rather than engagement and explanation. But it's a real issue, I think, in any city at the moment, e-scooters.
Chairman, you're on mute.
That's lucky, because actually what I said wasn't at all of any interest to anybody, so that's okay. Nobody missed out. My final question is, I've had an email actually from a resident, which I'll sort of paraphrase. And it's basically, apparently, there are a lot of problems down in Harmondsworth with cannabis factories and unoccupied buildings, groups of people threatening, going around on mopeds, a lack of police visibility in the village, feeling generally of unsafe. A violent robbery recently happened in the shops. Essentially, obviously, this is an email from a resident. I don't know completely the situation, but firstly, I wondered, is this on the radar? And secondly, if it's not on the radar necessarily, I mean, how would that sort of level of antisocial behaviour, how should it be policed and dealt with? So who wants to go first, Jill or Jackie?
I'm happy to go first.
Yeah.
You've raised a lot of different potential criminal elements of behaviour in there. Cannabis factories, I would say, are not antisocial behaviour. They're crime, full stop, and they're organised crime, and they're drivers of serious violence. And it's one of my real frustrations when people say, I was stopped and I only had a bit of cannabis on me for personal use and that sort of thing. It's actually any drugs contributes to organised crime and serious violence. So I guess my first thing would be is, are you confident that we have been told that information that you have? Because the biggest plea that I can make to the public is you need to give us the intel if we're going to do anything on it. And quite a lot of time people will assume that somebody else has told us. If it's something they're seeing in their community regularly, they will just assume that somebody has told us. And quite often, and I'm sure Jackie sees this, quite often that's not the case and nobody will have told us. So, cannabis factories are, once we get some intelligence on them, they're quite easy for us to corroborate and they're quite easy for us to get warrants for. All police officers love getting warrants for cannabis factories. So, yeah, absolutely, we would deal with that if we had the intelligence. In relation to other antisocial behaviour, it very much depends on what it is, and I can only speak very generically. I don't know if Jackie has anything to add in relation to any of that.
Jackie, you want to come in here?
Yeah, if that was raised as a members' inquiry, probably the first thing I would do is to make contact with the local police, the Safer Neighbourhood team, or depending on what it is, perhaps it may be another department within the police that I would go to. But also I would make inquiries internally to try and elicit information that we would hold as a council which may assist the police. So for example, who's living at that address, or who's paying the business rates, or whatever it is, we would try and support them in any action they take by finding out the information that we hold.
Okay, so basically, essentially, report, even if you think other people are reporting it. And ultimately, in terms of this sort of specific email that came to me, and of course, I know only of it from the email, in a sense, obviously, contact your local councillors to put in the members' inquiry, as well as continuing to report it, and then hopefully the two can work together to try and sort of, you know, resolve the fear, basically, and the issues being raised in this email. Does that sound like a fair sort of summary?
It does. And if I could just add to that, in relation to CCTV, sometimes we get things reported that might be over several days. And actually, if somebody is able to give us a specific date or a time, or certainly a time span that we can look at, we have some excellent cameras across the borough, and we have had some really good results when we've worked in partnership with the police. So we can often elicit this information, but it's important that we have detailed information wherever possible, you know, clothing, descriptions, vehicle registration numbers, anything. I appreciate sometimes it's not always possible to get that level of intelligence, but as much detail as people can give, the better chance we have of actually catching somebody.
No, I think that's very good advice. Okay, I mean, I'll reply to the email, but hopefully the person who sent me the email is watching, so they would have got that information. But anyway, so there's no more hands up. So at this point, I would ask, would somebody like to second the discussion to be noted, so we can move on? Yeah, Simon, your hand's up. Simon seconded it. So thank you very much, Jill. Thank you very much, Jackie, and we look forward to speaking to you again in the future.
Thank you very much. Good night.
Good night. Right, so we move on to item 6. By the way, Jill and Jackie can leave. Yes, you don't have to stay if you don't want to. So we've come on to the work programme. So I'll let Nikki introduce the work programme, and then we can talk about it.
Thank you, Chairman. Okay, so at Council on the 23rd of February, members agreed the programme of meetings for the 21-22 municipal year. I've included in the work programme report information on the dates on the second page of the report, the dates of the new municipal year. I haven't included the room bookings on there. Members may be aware that currently legislation stipulates that we are allowed to hold meetings remotely up until the 7th of May. We're not sure yet whether this will be extended. So in the meantime, what we've done is I've actually arranged for meeting rooms to be booked for all of the meetings for the new municipal year. But that will be subject to whether or not the legislation changes and whether or not we actually continue to hold our meetings virtually. As for the next 2 meetings, which are scheduled for the 28th of April and the 29th of April, we, if members are happy to continue, we'll be holding those two virtually, remotely. So on the report, it actually says CR5 or virtual, but I think we'll keep them as virtual for now. And then, so the first meeting on the 28th is the Hillingdon Hospital redevelopment, Hillingdon Hospital performance, but also Mount Vernon Cancer Centre. where we'll be looking at the progress that's being made with the review of the cancer centre services at Mount Vernon. We will, on the 29th, be having updates from all of the other hospital or the other trusts. So we've got London Ambulance Service, CNWL, Royal Brompton and Harefield. I've also invited Health Watch Hillingdon and the LMC along to that meeting. Oh, and Hillingdon Health and Care Partners as well to that meeting. If members would like to look to the appendix to the report, I have filled in for the next municipal year potential topics for each of the meetings. The statutory health scrutiny role I've filled in. These dates aren't set in stone. Members can change them if they choose. But we do need to scrutinise health at least twice each year, and we need to scrutinise crime and disorder because we also have the statutory responsibility for scrutinising crime and disorder. There are a few gaps on the report. So we have nothing scheduled in for the June, which is the first meeting of the new municipal year, October, January 22 and March 22. So in the report, I have included a few potential topics that members may like to discuss to decide whether or not these are issues that they would like to discuss at any of these meetings that currently have nothing in them, or if they have any other topics that they would like to raise at those meetings. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Nikki. First of all, I apologise about the sound behind me. We've had a Tesco's delivery just arrived and my girls are still up, so it sounds like there won't be any biscuits when I get out of this meeting. But anyway, the sacrifices I'm prepared to make. Thank you very much for that summary. And I really wanted us to put this on the agenda today because our two meetings in April I think are going to be quite intense when we scrutinise local health providers. You know, the one very much on what's going on with the new build of the hospital and Hillingdon Hospital performance along with the cancer centre, alongside you know, everybody else, you know, the mental health staff, CNWL, all that sort of stuff on the next day. So I thought today would be actually a really good opportunity to maybe sort of put some ideas out there about the type of stuff we can look at. Of course, very much our core is, you know, the health stuff, local, you know, Hillingdon Hospital being rebuilt, all that sort of stuff, and also the police stuff that we've held today. But we do have space to potentially do maybe 3 other interesting topics. So I had a chat with Nikki, and also I sort of looked around to see what's, you know, was interesting in terms of external bodies in the council, because I want to make sure that when we look at stuff, it's stuff that actually can make a difference as well, stuff that there might be power for us to do stuff with, or at least be annoying in the right possible way to the right agencies to get something done. And so if you look under paragraph 10, there are 6 different potential topics. I'm not asking for a decision tonight, but what I'd like is an initial sort of thoughts, because ultimately I think we'll potentially be too tired to have a deeper discussion in April, but ultimately in April I'd like to make decisions at least on 2 of the 3, so we can, you know, really get started, because we've got a spare space in June. So very quickly, I'm sure you read the papers, so I'm not going to go into them. I think the 6 potential topics which could be of great value is preventative health, which is, you know, the golden goose of health, basically one of those things that everybody says is very important, but then the here and now take over. But I think in terms of looking at how our partners work together to deal with big issues, you know, we could pick an issue such as dealing with child obesity, for example. I have had suggestions of cancer screening and childhood immunisation, but seeing how, you know, those to sort of try and you know, stop people having to go into the healthcare system. So that's one of those. And the second one, which I think would be really good for us to do something on, building on tonight's meeting, is our neighbourhood watch, that community and police and council, how they work together. Because even though obviously tonight we asked some good questions and there's some good answers. I know from personal experience as a councillor, there is definitely some gaps there, and I want to make sure that those 3 different communities can work together very well. So I personally, I think that would be a very good thing for us to look at, especially, there must be great lessons from elsewhere for us to learn from as well. I just feel like we can utilise our ability here even more. The third one, which is an interesting one, I came from through talking to officers, is actually essentially with the move to 5G and greater connectivity. Obviously, we're all working from home and having Teams meetings, so we understand that Hillingdon probably isn't where it should be in terms of its capacity. So it might be useful for us to get the sort of providers in and ask them what they're going to do in order to, make sure that our borough is connected as well as it could be, to enable, more people working from home, more businesses being set up. D is the perennial children's dental services. Over many years, our statistics haven't been good on that, in terms of children, going to the dentist, and then obviously children having oral health problems. So always something to look into. E is a very interesting one, potentially a single issue meeting, which is to look at journalism and local democracy. I was fascinated when Nikki told me that this actually is in our remit, thanks to the BBC sort of local democracy fund. And in terms of how communication happens at a local level, I think, I don't want to be disparaging to the local newspaper, but when I first came here, it seemed to have a different profile and do different things. In some ways, things like next door has taken over, so it could be interesting to sort of see about that. And finally, essentially something about apprenticeships and adult learning and how that's supported. Obviously, with COVID going on, furlough sort of mass potential levels of unemployment, reskilling people working for longer. These are big issues, and the partnerships between organisations, colleges, and also the council could be very useful. So those were sort of, I think, where I was coming from at the moment. So I've got Stuart and Simon's hand up first. So Simon, what are your thoughts on all of this?
I think Stuart was first, Chairman.
That's okay, but that's Chairman's prerogative. I can call whoever I want in whatever order. I'm going to use my power, and I pick you, Simon, even if you're not ready.
I think the list of topics are really good. My only comment would be if we can only choose some of them. We did do children's dental services. It wasn't that long ago. Perhaps, Nikki, you remember when we was?
Chairman, the Children's Dental Services was a select panel that was set up by the committee. It's so far held 1 meeting and hasn't actually finished its review because there were changes to the membership of the cabinet. 2 of the 5 members on the select panel actually went into the cabinet, which means they can't actually take part in the scrutiny. So rather than starting with new members, I wondered whether it would be prudent to actually have that as a single meeting and finish it so that we actually have it as a single meeting within our normal meetings rather than as a select panel meeting.
Chairman, that answers my question. So, thank you.
I think that idea sounds good. Stuart.
Thank you, Chair. I particularly am keen on the connectivity, and the journalism one intrigues me, not because I'm into journalism, but more it's just how it's evolved. I wondered if it's within scope, if we could look at the Environment Agency and the work they're doing within Hillingdon. I know that the RESPOC is looking at waterways generally and flooding and bits like that, but specifically scrutinising the work of the Environment Agency in Hillingdon would be useful, and whether we can get other partners like the Con Valley, I've forgotten the full title of the trust, but as well to talk about what they're doing. The timing would work well, I think, for the borough, and it would be useful to add support and scrutiny as needed in that area.
Stuart, were you specifically thinking about flooding, or were you thinking about other areas?
For me, it's around river maintenance and upkeep. I think the flooding stuff the council is working on in other areas, it's not about the canals or even the water treatment. It's more about how are our rivers being maintained with the multiple partners and agencies involved.
Okay, I'll let Nikki take that one away, because I mean, one of the interesting challenges is for us to make sure that we stay within our remit and don't jump around on other people's toes, which is, I came up with loads of ideas which apparently other people might be doing. So I exaggerate slightly, but I think that's a very interesting one to look at. So, Nikki, are you happy to look at that as a possible one that we could do?
Chairman, I'll go away and find out some more information about about the issue and then bring it back to the next meeting.
Thank you. June.
Graham,
Sorry, Ray. Sorry. June had her hand up first, so I'm going to go to June first, and I'll come to you. If that's okay.
That's fine. Yeah.
June.
Okay. The 5G connection. I'm a bit concerned about that because I've noticed around the borough there's lots of these massive big communication poles going up. And, you know, it's just shooting up all around. It's now coming closer to home. So for us to look into the 5G connection, is that, for me, is that we're going to ask for more or restrict what's going up? Is that what you want to come out of that?
Well, I think,
and I will support Strout in regards to the for us to look at the environment, because the water is an issue around the borough, and I hope we're not stepping on anybody's foot, but I'm sure that come under our remit. That needs to be looked into because we're having lots of problem with the environment pertaining to the water, pertaining to the canals and the rivers and everything, and the flooding also that's happening around the borough, especially when we're having very heavy rainfall.
Thanks, Jude. I think if we were to look at the 5G and greater connectivity, it would have to take in both. Obviously, getting greater connectivity and making sure that we're up to speed. Please excuse the pun, which was intended. But also at the same time, you're right, safety is so important, and community buy-in into how this is done. So I think both issues are very important. Thank you, June. Ray.
Yes, I wasn't sure, Chairman, if you were noticing that I was wanting to raise a question because of the problems I've had on the computer.
That's okay.
But what I was going to say was simply that it was recently highlighted that children in Hillingdon are facing a long wait for mental health referral, and I wondered if that's within our remit because it's longer than 20 hours. It says, as the headline, children and young people in Hillingdon had to wait an average of 46 days for a follow-up appointment after their initial mental health referral. And I just wonder if that's something we ought to perhaps take on board.
I mean, potentially. I mean, that would be a great one to raise on our meeting on the 29th, the second of the two meetings in April, because that one will be covering partly mental health, and it will have CNWL, who I think are in charge of this stuff. So maybe after you've asked your questions about it to them, then we can sort of think about if there's any further work, but it's definitely an issue under our remit. Thank you, Ray.
Right,
Simon, you've got your physical hand up. That's old school.
Thank you, Chairman. Actually, it was more a question for Nikki, really, and that is, we did say a while back that we would regularly look at Hillingdon Hospital build as a separate meeting. Is that factored into this schedule?
Can I answer this, actually? Very
Absolutely.
So, because this is partly my decision. And I'm having meetings occasionally with health partners, including on the build, and when I have stuff to report back, I'll definitely report back. But my feeling straight away was that the two meetings that we had at the end of April, which were booked in, actually the way they used to be run were quite tiring. I didn't think that maybe we got the best out of them. I personally, there was too much information for us to process in an effective way. I firstly found that. So what I decided that we should do is the first meeting, the one we have on the 27th or 28th, I can't remember which one, that is specifically focused on the Hillingdon Hospital build. And then attached to that, because the same people will be there, will be general performance. And then with the cancer, Mount Vernon Cancer Review, that came in later because actually it's related to the hospital build, both in Hillingdon and in Watford actually as well. So in a sense, that is a big meeting on that. And when I spoke to the chief executive and the deputy chief executive of Hillingdon Hospital about this, that seemed to be the right time in them being able to talk to us about stuff and announce us about stuff, because as you can imagine, this process is very bureaucratic. So that seemed to be like a really good point to say, actually, we think we're here now, and this is what's going to be happening over the next few years. Now, I've actually included that as business as usual, to be honest. And I think what we will do is afterwards, depending on timelines, some of the health meetings updates that we have, we might specifically focus just on the Hillingdon Hospital build because it's so important. It's important that we do scrutinise all our health partners, but at the same time, I don't just want to have a list of people turning up to meetings just because they turn up to meetings and talk to us. If they're really key issues, that we need to focus on those. So I think that's how we're going forward with that. So I hope that answers your question, Simon. Is that okay? Great. Fantastic. Okay, so essentially we'll have to, depending on personnel, of course, because who knows what will happen, in terms of potentially in May's council mayoral meeting. But ultimately, in April, it would be good for us to sort of pin down a few things that we can start, so we can start the next year doing some really interesting projects. If over the next few weeks you have any other ideas, please email me and Nikki, because that'll be the time for Nikki to basically look into this stuff. We'll definitely look into the environmental agency point, but beyond that, certainly the 5G greater connectivity, and I think for me the OWL Neighbourhood Watch, community and policing and Hillingdon Council thing, I think there's some really good spaces in there. Then maybe finishing off the children's dental services, I think seems to be where we're at the moment. But we'll confirm things after our second meeting in April. Okay, if everybody's happy with the report, can somebody please second that we can move on? Simon, you put your hand up, so Simon can second. Thank you very much. Okay, is that, I've lost my order of business. Is that everything, Nikki, for today?
Chairman, that is everything.
Brilliant, fantastic. Okay, well, thank you very much. It's been a really good meeting again. I look forward to speaking in April. Okay, bye.
Can I please ask everybody to stay on mute while I stop the recording? Thank you.